If you're watching this in the hope that I'm heavily going to discuss the story, then this video isn't for you. I will talk about the story to an extent, but there are loads of other videos out there that are already in depth and delve into the problems regarding the overall storytelling in this title. For the most part, I'm going to be discussing the gameplay and more the pacing, if that makes sense. Probably not, but let's stop waffling and start the video. Anyway, big spoilers ahead, so play the game first before you watch this, obviously. In this series, I look at the ways in which the game can improve with a few adjustments. This is The Last of Us Part 2, and you're watching Game Tweaks. Before we properly get into it, I do want to say that I did enjoy the game at times. Some parts were great, but some parts were pretty poor. It's essentially a good game with many problems. So let's look at my first problem with the game, the overall difficulty. At the start, it's exciting, as with most games, you usually start a new campaign with limited resources and abilities and gain more as you progress. In Part 2, you do get that sense of helplessness, and you are on occasion forced to scavenge to stand a fighting chance. On the normal difficulty, it seems like it's a fair challenge up until about a quarter of the way through, where it seems like you have enough ammo and upgrades to wipe out humanity itself. It seems a bit daft playing on this difficulty, as there isn't much of a challenge again until the game switches over from Ellie to Abby. The problem is, the higher difficulty seems to give you the same amount of supplies, but instead makes the enemies more of a bullet sponge. It's completely off balance. The campaign difficulty would have benefited to have more options other than just say, easy, normal and hard. It could have had a slider of sorts to implement how much or how little you want the game to give you supplies and level difficulty, similar to how other games approach things. When going back to get extra footage, I actually found myself enjoy the gameplay a lot more, as I was not picking up as much pills, ammo and supplies, which again proves my point as to why there should be a system in place that reduces the amount of pickups without interfering with the game. Now this is my biggest issue with the game, and in fact, a lot of modern day games in general. Let's look at the length of the game. The game is about 25 hours long, but it would have been ample if the game was half that in my opinion. It's painful looking at your equipment and upgrades when the game sort of restarts halfway through, and just seeing very little, knowing full well that you have to start over from scratch. I love it when games do this but temporarily, like Silent Hill 2's removal of the weapons to access the lift, like we talked about in the other video, or like in Fallout New Vegas's casino areas. This technique works well in these games because you know the end is in sight. Or, it's because you know that you get everything back eventually. This game, however, doesn't grasp that, and it's quite insulting to ask the player to do it all again. The upgrade system carries on from the original, and it has more things to upgrade. I wish you could use the points or share them with Abby. Scavenging seems pointless when you've already filled up ammo and health. Even playing on hard mode seems overkill with the amount of supplies you find. Sure, you can be overwhelmed with enemies at first, but you restock in a few minutes. This definitely needs retweaking, as there's no fear factor. The whole purpose of a survival horror game is to make you dread what your next encounter is going to be. In Part 2, however, I find it less intimidating than the first. I love the combination of humans and infected at the same time. This makes the game fun to experiment with. You can draw the infected towards the humans and try to avoid them both by hiding somewhere and just simply watching them fight it out. Fighting either of them solo though is a bit repetitive. They play out the same way time and time again. Distract the enemy, run behind them and kill them, etc. Also, if you have fought a group of humans, you would put your money on the next encounter being the infected, and vice versa. I know the game revolves around these two enemy types, but it would be awesome to have others. In one flashback, I genuinely thought this was going to be the case. Ellie stumbles on a wild boar. Imagine having to worry about them too. There's also a lot of water in this game. Wouldn't it have been cool to have something else to worry about, like alligators or something? This would definitely add more variety. Apparently this was supposed to happen, but never materialized. That's a damn shame. Other games implement dangerous wildlife for you to worry about, and this would have been perfectly suited for the level layout. Towards the end of the game, I felt like it was crying out for a new mechanic. Although we did get the use of freeing up the tied infected so they could help you out against the Rattlers settlement, that was cut way too short and could have been introduced a little earlier too. There's nothing worse when games break momentum. At points in the game, it starts to get interesting story-wise, and suddenly there's a flashback out of nowhere. Now, I like the use of Abby's nightmares, as that's the thing driving her character. However, a lot of the other ones seem unnecessary. Then you have ones where Ellie and Joel encounter a bloater. It doesn't make sense, as later in the game, we meet a bloater in the arcade anyway. It would have definitely been more effective not to meet one up until this point, so that the boss reveal is a bigger surprise. Also, if you think about it, Abby's segments have flashbacks within flashbacks, which makes it a bit more complicated at times, trying to work out where the timelines are. I'm sort of breaking my own promise here of focusing just on the gameplay, but this is such a big issue I just couldn't leave it out. This is a smaller issue with the game, but I've seen a lot of people question why there wasn't a separate multiplayer mode. Have a look at this. In the past, I remember booting up the PS4 just to play a few rounds of Factions. It gave any cover shooter a run for its money. To this day, the servers are still active, which is pretty amazing. Also, the game just lacks replay value in general. There's no side story to accompany the main dish. There was a cool little side story in the original where it served as a mini prequel. Nothing like that in here. Or what about the hundreds of collectibles in the game? What purpose do they serve? Not much. Imagine if there was a way to redeem them to unlock proper rewards. Something like a minigame perhaps. The Last of Us Golf, anyone? No, I went too far there, like. The game is lacking something else to make it more worthwhile. The 3 things that I mentioned there would have made a world of difference. Halfway through the game, it sort of comes to an end for Ellie, or so you think. The game fades to black mid-cutscene, and suddenly you control Abby for another 10 to 12 hours. Why? There's 2 better ways they could have tackled this. 1. Why can't they both have separate campaigns, like a choice at the start of the game? Or 2. Have them swap every few chapters from the off. That would be a cool way of showing a cat and mouse situation that works so well in films. Or maybe the 2 characters are given a device, like a radio or something. In fact, there's a moment where I genuinely thought this was going to be the case, but it never delivered. I actually like the idea of playing as a new character for a bit. The problem isn't fully Abby herself, but how long you play as her. It just feels like the game is moving at a much slower pace when it should be speeding up towards the end. I know I bang on about Resident Evil a lot, but this exact same thing happens in one of my favourite games, Code Veronica. The reason why the changing of characters works so well in that game is because you play as one character escaping a certain area for 3/4 of the game. The characters switch over for the remaining quarter and you get to see the aftermath. On top of this, the characters play differently from one another. One takes more damage but is able to carry more, while the other one takes less damage but carries less. There's a real trade-off, and it makes it really well entwined for both gameplay and story. Part 2 could have seriously learned from this and put its own spin on the formula. The truth is, Ellie and Abby play too similar to each other. Part 2 is filled with missed opportunities. For instance, on Seraphite Island, you fight a Seraphite brute. It would have been more epic if you fought Isaac instead. It builds this antagonist up so much, but in the end he dies mid-cutscene. What's the point in that? There's also a moment later on in the game where you think that Ellie's story is wrapping up, and Tommy comes to reignite a war against Abby, but Ellie doesn't seem interested. I thought that the game was going to switch character yet again, but to Tommy, and he would sort of tie up loose ends with Abby. It would have been interesting to end the game playing as a new character with their own traits, but sadly, this wasn't to be. Can you imagine the rage that Tommy would possess while controlling him? Maybe that could have been one of his traits. He might have been more melee-based after all he's been through. This is a small one, but a little feature that I loved from the first. Although you do get shivs for defensive purposes with Abby, one thing I do miss is constructing a shiv for a door. This was great as you used resources to construct this weapon that was a one-hit kill or use it on a door that led to a stash of equipment. This was scrapped for some reason. Seems a tough thing not to include an element of risk in a horror title. Let's talk about enemies. There are great moments when you see enemies like the Stalkers or Seraphites for the first time. The game really comes to life and it makes you be more cautious in the way you play. Unfortunately though, once you have taken a few of these enemy types down, they lose their appeal and you start to take them less seriously. I find it hard to believe that in this world, the spores have been able to mutate humans but not animals. As we discussed before, some form of water enemy would have been epic, but what about if there was some flying things in the sky? Like a clicker crow or something? Or what if there was some kind of clicker variant where it was underground and it came out to grab you? That would be scary for sure. The stealth is another area of the game where it works well, especially the tall grass. Enemies will inspect it if they see it moving or get too close to you. In other titles, it's so lazy for using tall grass as a safe area where the enemies suddenly turn blind and they're unable to see you. This is probably my favourite feature in the game that doesn't need improving. Outside of the tall grass, however, a way of spicing things up in terms of stealth would be for the player to interact differently to certain scenarios. For instance, when we are introduced to the Seraphite enemies, we are shown that they keep track of their team by whistling. Wouldn't it have been fun to whistle after you kill an enemy so they don't realise that anything has happened? A simple button prompt would have worked. We see in other stealth-heavy games that you have a number of different ways of doing things. Another obvious tweak in the stealth department would have been the use of a disguise. Now this is absolutely criminal for a stealth game. You are constantly getting swarmed by wolf members. This would have been awesome to sneak around enemies, but if you get too close, they go aggro or something like that. I know this is more suited to the Uncharted series, but it would have been nice to have a few more puzzles. It does have some minor puzzles with the safes in the game. Yeah, it's fun to decipher them on occasion, but they get dull, as the rewards don't seem worth it in my opinion. You can already take out waves of enemies, but have ample supplies to pick up in every area anyway. It would have worked if the game wasn't so littered with ammo. I can't tell you how many times my reward for opening a safe was mostly the ammo that I already had. Even some of the physics-based puzzles are totally welcome, although these don't happen frequently enough for my liking. I just think with a few more of these puzzles sprinkled throughout the game, it would have really fattened out the whole experience for me. After all, who doesn't love a good puzzle from time to time? Oh, that's probably just me. The game sort of hands you most of the weapons from the off. I don't want to hammer it too much, as this can sometimes be the case in many other games also, but it would have benefited from, say, the rifle or other powerful guns to be given to you in the final chapters of the game to make the journey more fun. Next up, we need to talk about the absurd amount of collectibles in this game. 286. This is just taking the piss. The cards could also be used differently to make it worthwhile. In fact, the final showdown with Ellie and Abby could have been resolved with a few card games. I usually enjoy picking up and reading notes that have relevance to the situation or moments leading up to something big happening. However, I find it completely pointless when the notes have nothing to do with anything. I sort of understand what they were trying to go for, to make the members of Wolf seem more human, and also trying to paint a picture of how the world was before the outbreak. But we don't need that many instances where you open the drawer and find meaningless excerpts. Hands down, the best moment of the game is towards the end with the Rat King. It's one of the more scary and action-packed moments in the game. It's bizarre to say that because it happens around 70% in the game. That's the issue. At its core, The Last of Us Part 2 is a horror game. Once you encounter the same enemies time and time again, it gets boring real fast. Other shoutouts go towards the tripwire sequence, the whole boat moment, avoiding Sniper Tommy, and Ellie and Abby in the theatre. I know I'm praising the game here and there, and with good reason, but I do find it an issue that the best moments in the game happen few and far in between. Unfortunately, the bulk of the game just seems so copy and paste. So there we have it. I've talked you through many areas where the game could improve with some tweaks here and there. I genuinely think that if Naughty Dog made these changes, like making the game shorter, exploring different enemy types, etc., then I think this game would have been more loved. Yeah, sure, the story has many issues, but for me, the problems lie elsewhere. Despite all this, I did still have fun with the game at times. It's just so deflating to see how the final product turned out. Thanks for watching the video. If you would like to help this channel grow, I would appreciate it if you liked, commented and subscribed. Also, have a look at my channel for more videos on different games. Thanks for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.